Today we are talking about Telesto. This is an exotic fusion rifle. Now pre-Forsaken, it was present in our power slot, and it was still pretty powerful back then. But then after Forsaken, once the new sandbox went live, Telesto was turned into a special weapon and was then moved to our energy slot. Now all was fine and dandy in the world until people started getting mapped by Telesto on a regular basis. And that was because Telesto's damage was still the exact same as it was when it was in the heavy slot. Needless to say, Telesto has generated a mountain of salt since then. Well, no longer. Telesto's base damage for each of its bolts has been reduced by 19%. I know, sounds absolutely terrible, but they did increase the optic stat from 15 to 20 to be more comparable with other fusion rifles with scope perks. We'll talk about that in a little more depth, but then just to add a cherry on top, the PVE damage for Telesto has been increased by 30%. That's a pretty substantial buff. Now first up, let's educate ourselves on Telesto. It shoots these crystals. You can call them bolts if you want to, that's what we call other fusion rifles. I'm going to refer to them as crystals, but it shoots 7 of them at a time. Now, it comes with the exotic perk Unplanned Reprieve. Fusion projectiles attach and detonate with a delayed void blast. Not as delayed as it was back in Destiny 1, but still delayed. Now, the trait found on this weapon is Harbinger's Pulse. Multi-kills with this weapon immediately reload your equipped kinetic and energy weapons from reserves. A very useful perk, especially in something like PVE. Now, first, let's talk about that 19% reduction in base damage. Pre 2.1.4, Telesto in PvP was hitting 48 per bolt. Now Telesto has somewhat of a unique ability, as it also does impact damage from those crystals. So for each crystal that you land, you're also doing an extra 1 damage per bolt, or 1 damage per crystal. But pre 2.1.4, you can kill any Guardian 8 resilience or less in 4 crystals. So simply landing 4 out of these 7 crystals, you get the point, boys. Now in 2.1.4, Telesto is hitting 39 per crystal. The impact damage is still 1 per crystal though, but instead of killing Guardians in 4 crystals, it now requires 5. But it does allow you to kill any Guardian non-resilience or less in those 5 crystals. Now despite those differences in base damage, Telesto still has the capabilities to map. I would say that its kill range was probably on par with some of the best rolled Erentils out there, maybe even a little better. Now that could be due to the fact that they did increase the zoom optics of the weapon up to 20. I found that the fusion rifle was a little more stickier and the bolts did seem to have less spread in those long ranges. An unfortunate consequence of that though is I felt that Telesto seemed to drag behind opponents that were rushing me. Again, that was just my experience. Could just be because my aim is awful. I don't know, one or the other. I'm just saying Telesto, a weapon I've used a bunch, especially before Forsaken, seemed to react differently in close quarter combat. But in terms of being a fusion rifle that can map, Telesto can still do that. Landing 5 crystals is not a tough thing to do, so to rule Telesto out and say that it's a terrible weapon is untrue. I think the only thing you're not going to get from this weapon is those easy double kills, right? To hit a group of enemies and just watch the bolts tear them all up to shreds. Now that with that reduction in those crystals, you're more than likely going to get the single kill and bring the other guy's health down almost all the way down, and you'll have to finish him off. And considering that this is a 780 charge rate fusion, but still has the mapping capabilities of something like an Erentil at say somewhere around 860, Telesto is still a very good weapon, guys. Now moving on to PvE. This is where Telesto impressed me the most. First up at Greg, Telesto was hitting 859 per crystal, which is a very large amount, guys. If you look at something like Merciless, Merciless does 634 per bolt. Now, of course, if you have Merciless with Impetus, which is the trait found on Merciless, that does raise the bolt damage to 950 per bolt, but only for like a duration of like maybe 3 to 4 bolts. The fact that Telesto is less than 100 damage from Merciless with Impetus is actually pretty crazy. If y'all remember our Telesto Sin build, where we took Nezarec's Sin and combined it here with Telesto, that build has gotten even nastier. Now granted, Telesto probably still can't beat Merciless in terms of outright DPS to something like bosses, considering that Merciless itself is more designed for that with conserved momentum, as it increases that rate of fire with each non-lethal hit. But in terms of dealing with like majors, chewing through strikes, running through Gambit. You really can't go wrong with Telesto now. And here recently I was pairing it with Top Tree Voidwalker since Cataclysm has gotten a massive buff in 2.1.4. We will be reviewing that subclass, but for those that just want to know the rundown, that subclass is disgusting in PvE. So overall guys, yes, Telesto was nerfed, but it's still very much viable. I would say that the crystals stay even more together at the mid-range. And for my PvE players, Telesto is an excellent exotic to bring in PvE now. Well, fellas and ladies, thank you all for coming and watching, and as always,
slap that like button like your mama told you right.